Good morning, and let me introduce myself, Keith McBain, the Ambassador to Norway. And on behalf of our embassies in Finland, Sweden and Norway, I'd like to warmly welcome you to this webinar event marking International Women's Day 2022 on breaking the bias. And our discussion today is underpinned by human values of equality, tolerance, and the recognition of minorities. And we've nothing more fundamental than the right to live in peace and with security. And just before moving to our theme this morning, I'd like, on behalf of all of us, to acknowledge the resilience and courage of the people of Ukraine and ensure them of our unwavering support. And on this day, our thoughts go out in particular to the women and children caught up in this terrible conflict. Today's event promises to be a very timely discussion which weaves together experiences and common strands between the Sami community living in the far north of Europe and the traveller community in Ireland. And there's a lot to consider in terms of shared but also different experiences. Both are communities with long and rich histories which have faced particular challenges in terms of acceptance and recognition, with women, of course, playing a very crucial role. And we have a distinguished panel of speakers representing the Sami and traveller communities who'll be introduced by our moderator, Dr. Susanne Normann from the University of Oslo. And congratulations are due to Dr. Normann, who I have the pleasure to introduce, as she was just awarded her PhD last week. And she is an acknowledged expert on Sami challenges and has contributed to research on climate change and looking at the lived experiences of people in the indigenous and other communities where climate change mitigation threatens their future life prospects and can violate rights. So I think we have an interesting session ahead of us. And with that, Dr. Normann, I give you the floor to take over from here. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the invitation, and congratulations to all women today for this day of struggle and also celebration of the gains we have had. I will now introduce this very prominent panel of speakers. The program for today will be beginning with my introduction of them, and then they will give an introduction each one of 5 minutes, and then we will have a discussion and open up for Q&As from the audience. So first I want to introduce Niamni Bryn. She is a researcher at the Department of Media and Communication, University of Oslo. Her research focuses on how minority and indigenous children and young people engage with digital media. She is particularly interested in digitalization, participation, and media innovation. Nibrin participates in national and international research networks and projects which explore these topics. Next, we have Dr. Cindy Joyce. She's a Minker or Traveller Indigenous ethnic minority of Ireland. She comes from Newcastle West, County Limerick, and she is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Limerick. She's a human rights defender, a sociologist, and a member of President Michael Dr. Higgins' Council of State. Her research focuses on human rights, racism, hate crime, ethnicity, identity, and social political constructions of Irish travellers. And finally, we have Åsa Larsson-Blind. She's the Vice President of the Sami Council, having served as President for the term 2017 to 2021. She has been a member of the Sami Council since 2008 and was elected as Vice President for the first time in 2011. Larsson-Blind was the Sami Council Board member of the Indigenous Peoples Secretariat from 2011 to 2015 and served also in that period as the HOD for the Sami Council at the Arctic Council meetings. So thanks to all three of you for joining this highly topical meeting. I would first give the word to our final speaker, Åsa Larsson-Blind. So please welcome Åsa Larsson-Blind.
Thank you. Good day to all of you. And thank you to the organizers for inviting me to participate today. And thank you for the lovely introduction. My name is Åsa Larsson Blind, as was introduced, and I'm working for the Sami Council. And I will give you a short, brief introduction both to overall the Sami community and to the work of Sami Council, and also address a few pressing issues that might be suitable to bring up as a day as today. The Sami community, the Sami people, we are an indigenous people, and we are living in the northernmost part of Sweden, Norway, Finland, and Kola Peninsula on the Russian side. So we are an indigenous people that are divided by state borders, and this, of course, makes up for very many challenges as a people to keep our community between these state boundaries that are crossing through language areas and, of course, our culture. And Sami Council, we are an NGO, an IPO, Indigenous Peoples Organization, and we have been ongoing since 1956. So we are actually one of the oldest Indigenous Peoples Organizations still functioning in the world. Sami Council, we are, our members are Sami organizations in all areas of Sápmi, the traditional Sami territory. So we have 9 member organizations. So we represent the civil Sami society. And we have a rights-based approach in everything we do, and we promote Sami culture and rights, both in Sápmi nationally, but we work very much on the international arena, together with indigenous brothers and sisters under the UN and under the Arctic Council that are currently, of course, like very much else in the crisis of today, on pause. But we are working to strengthen indigenous rights, the indigenous rights movement internationally, also to influence the national levels in Sápmi. And the Sami society, I have to say, we when it comes to talking about the actual situation, we don't have much statistics, we don't have much data, and that is because, of course, the Sami people, that we don't really know how many we are, since the Nordics doesn't count on an ethnicity. And this is a challenge, of course, since we know who we are and we know what we need. We know that in today's society, we also need to be able to present our needs to others. And Sami, as living as a minority in majority societies, we are seen through the majority kind of system's eyes, and when all the states look at their own, within their own borders, it also is a hindrance to talk about the Sami society as one, and looking at the possibilities and the potential of Sami society when we talk about language areas that are basically moving not north-south but east-west. So these borders are stretching and dividing these areas. And so there is a great need to strengthen the Sami society's own institutions, in order for us to also gather and collect the data needed to present statistics, and also to be able to define our own identities, culture, and our own life choices. So I think I will stop there, and I'm looking forward to hearing the other panelists before we get into a discussion also. Thank you.
Thank you so much for a very interesting beginning, Åsa. I will now pass the word to Niamh Breen. Please welcome also to this panel.
Thank you so much, Susanne. Thank you also for the opportunity to participate in this panel and to join you all in celebrating International Women's Day. My name is Niamh Breen, and I'm a researcher at the Department of Media and Communication at the University of Oslo. My research explores how young minority and indigenous children and young people use digital media, with a particular focus on how these people can create opportunities to communicate in media and use their languages. So in the next couple of minutes, I want to talk a little bit about my research, but also point to some issues which I think can be interesting and are important to take up in our discussion afterwards. So in my PhD research, I looked at how young Northern Sami and Irish language users engaged in different social media platforms to create opportunities to use their language and how they considered that their languages were relevant in these contexts. And one of the most important topics I focused on there was the question of access. And this is important because in countries like Ireland, Norway, Sweden, Finland, we kind of take it for granted that we have ubiquitous access to the internet and to digital media and to all of the opportunities to communication that these media represent. But it's often easy to forget that access to digital media and to these opportunities is not always experienced in the same way, depending on what kind of background you're coming from, whether this is on the grounds of you being part of a minority or an indigenous community, or on the grounds of your gender or other potential grounds. So following the participants in my study, I observed their interactions in platforms over 18 months. And I also observed and asked them, talk to them about the kind of extra social and technological lengths they needed to go to in order to communicate in their languages on these platforms. And importantly, like while the Northern Sami and the Sami in general and the Irish language contexts are very, very different, and minority contexts usually are, there are some important similarities in the obstacles that the participants in my studies encountered when they engaged in media. Firstly, at an infrastructural level, for example, the interfaces and mobile devices that the participants used don't always facilitate interaction in these languages. So some of my Sami participants, I remember talking to them about the fact that they needed to use 3 different keyboard solutions in order to communicate in their language to write a text message. So this kind of obstacle is significant when you just want to send a text message in your language to somebody about, hi, how are you, or whatever. And it means that you either don't use your language, or that you stop using the letters and characters that you need in order to communicate in the language. So it has consequences for communication. So there's also the fact that, for example, interface languages are not available in either Northern Sami or in Irish usually. And the main reason for this lack of availability or lack of localization is that the markets that these language communities represent are very, very small. And therefore, it's not worth the investment in terms of technological infrastructure or localization in order to provide these services for these people. So what the participants in my study in some cases did was that they themselves engaged in localization projects in designing technologies in order to be able to support language use. This, of course, is not really an option that's always available to people, and it requires a very high level of technical sophistication and competence, as well as a very strong level of engagement in terms of being determined to use your language and to communicate in these spaces. And of course, because of the fact that this is kind of individuals and groups of individuals that need to self-organize and engage with companies like Facebook, the metaverse, in order to kind of achieve the aims of the projects that they need, it's often quite sporadic, and it's difficult to sustain the kind of momentum that's needed in order to achieve real social change. So although the participants in my study were multilingual and they understood either English or Norwegian or Swedish in various cases, it could be argued that they do have fundamental access to platforms and digital devices. However, the way in which this access is available to them means that their own language use is restricted, and therefore it influences how their language relevance is perceived and how they communicate in their everyday lives. One really important reflection from my research has been the extent to which the challenges that different marginalized communities experience are faced with in contemporary media contexts, the extent to which these challenges are similar, and that it would therefore be beneficial to facilitate the sharing of experiences and resources in order to compare successes and failures, and to discuss how structural obstacles can be overcome. And this is relevant whether it's a gender specific or whether it's language specific or ethnicity specific challenges that are faced. The Indigenous Tweets website is one example of a tool that was designed by Professor Kevin Scannell at St. Louis University in Missouri. And this could be used to work in multiple contexts. So this was one of the examples that I came across when I was doing my research. It's based on a bot which is trained to crawl the internet and identify text in different languages. And then Scannell also used this bot then to identify different users of different languages communicating in Twitter and to establish a kind of directory of these languages so that find other people who are using their minority language in Twitter and maybe get in contact with them and start conversations in their language. So while the tool is significant in itself, it also highlights the potential benefits of collaboration and sharing experiences to overcome obstacles to access and communication. And the same can be said of the experiences of minority and Indigenous women. So while the cultural contexts in which they live their everyday lives are different, and while these differences are important and should be preserved, the structural constraints and consequences of gender discrimination are similar. And it would therefore seem important to develop opportunities to share experiences and learning about how these can be addressed. One final issue that I want to mention and that I think is extremely important, which Åsa also mentioned, is that of cyber hate. This complicates how users of different cultural and gendered backgrounds experience opportunities for communication in my field of interest, which is communication and interaction in digital media. So the EU Kids Online project, which is conducted in Norway and in 33 other European countries, found that 34% of Norwegian children and young people aged 9 to 16 experienced cyber hate during the past year in 2018. That's 1 in 3, and that's of all children and young people. We don't have research that looks at how Indigenous and minority children experience cyber hate, but it can be assumed that while this is representative research in the entire Norwegian context, can be assumed that minority and Indigenous children experience cyber hate to at least the same degree, if not potentially to a higher extent. And we also know that girls tend to be more disturbed by experiences of cyber hate than boys. And this gender aspect also needs to be investigated in the case of minority and Indigenous children, young people and women. So I'll end on this point because I think it's important to discuss further. And thank you again for the opportunity to join this conversation. And I'm looking very much forward to talking to the other panelists as well.
Thank you so much for a very interesting introduction. Now I'll pass the word to our last speaker, Dr. Cindy Joyce. Please welcome to the panel.
Thank you, Susanne. Hi, everybody. I just want to thank the organisers for having me here today to speak on this important discussion with other amazing women for International Women's Day. So I suppose I'm going to give kind of a brief introduction, I suppose, first of my community and some national statistics, and then just a kind of a brief introduction on the research that I do, and just kind of finish it then on kind of the methodologies, the importance of methodologies with marginalized communities, on what methodologies you use. So I suppose thank you for the wonderful introduction, Susanne. Just as Susanne stated, I am a member of the Irish Traveller community, which is Minkare in our own language, and our Pavi. And I suppose looking at our community here in Ireland, one of the most important things is that we have been recognised only in 2017 as an Indigenous ethnic minority in Ireland, and that has been something that has been a struggle and a fight for the community for many years in campaigning in order to be recognised. as an indigenous ethnic minority. And I suppose just looking at kind of the denial of, before that, the denial of our ethnicity was one of the things that was important, and it contributed to a lot of national statistics that are still not changed as of yet. But if you look at kind of the population of Ireland itself, we're looking at our population is only 0.7% of the whole general population. And when you look at the statistics, it's terrible statistics when we're looking at traveller males who live less than 10 years than the settled population, while traveller women can expect to live on an average of 12 years less than their settled counterparts. And just half of the population live up to the age of 40. So then when we go down to it, it's only 3% of our community that actually live over the age of 60. And I suppose when we're looking at the education statistics, then we're looking at only 13% of travellers complete second level education, compared to over 90% of the settled population. And 7 out of 10 have only primary or lower levels of education, while less than 1% complete third level education. So then you go into looking at the unemployment rates, and the unemployment rate stands at 82%, which is a really high statistic. And all of these statistics and all these issues, because I suppose statistics are numbers that are important. However, it's lives here that we're speaking of, and not numbers. We look at struggles of mental health issues. We have perhaps one of the highest suicide rates in the world, where we're nearly 7 times higher than the general population dying from suicide. So 11% of our community alone die from suicide. So when we're looking at kind of those statistics, they're really grim statistics that need to be changed. You know, everything, I suppose, in the power of the institutions, of the communities, of society, needs to have a focus on those issues and begin to start to change those statistics for more positive relations. And I suppose just looking at I suppose my research myself, I looked at young people in my community and how they were experiencing racism in an urban setting. And I used the methodology of the theorist Michel Diserto about walking in the city. So he took the methodology of literally walking with participants and observing their encounters and how they respond to those encounters in an urban setting. So I suppose when I was doing my field work with the young people, I did it from ages of 14 up to 21, and I divided them into the 2 groups of under 18s and over 18s. And then I had I did mixed gender groups, but and I also did groups of young women and groups of young men as well, and kind of looked at kind of the commonalities that they experience, but also the differences that they experience. So when we're looking at the Minker community and we're looking at traveller women, we can see that traveller women are triple discriminated against. You know, they're discriminated, first of all, I suppose, as travellers, and then they're discriminated as women, and then on top of that they're discriminated as the particular stereotype of traveller women in itself. So when we're looking at those statistics within my research, when I looked at the young traveller women that were experiencing negative encounters in urban settings, I also looked at how they would kind of strategize around that in order to overcome that in a more positive setting. And I suppose these strategies for the young people that they came up with themselves, they would be strategies that would encounter the negative encounter for that moment, but they're not long-term I suppose solutions to overcome negative encounters. You know, they act on the cuff of when they're encountered. So things like, for example, a lot of my community are denied access into shops, supermarkets, shopping centres, cinemas, restaurants, hotels, bars, you know, and so on. And when I looked at how some of the young women in my community kind of overcame these issues, a lot of kind of the strategies would be things like if they were going out to a bar, for example, or into a bar to have a cup of coffee, they would go before 6 o'clock, before the bouncer stands at the door, before there's any security, so that they would already be in there before they could be refused access. But then you have the issue of that when they're in there, if they stand outside the door to take a phone call, for example, they might not get back in. So when you're looking at kind of all those kind of strategies and the spatial kind of strategies that they use, those strategies are coming from the experiences and the historical experiences of the discrimination and racism that we as a community face. On a societal level and on a general level, but also in a policy level, when we look at kind of, I suppose, the contribution that denial of our ethnicity has done in that, but also looking at kind of because we're a nomadic community, the anti-nomadic policies that has been introduced as well has put kind of a struggle on the community. So, for example, in 2002, there was the Anti-Trespass Act law was put in, and that was disproportionately affected our community in that it became instead of a civil offence, it became a criminal offence for our community to move around with their caravan and park up, and by a criminal offence they could be fined up to €2,000 or given a prison sentence. And then when we're looking at, I suppose, the prison statistics, you're looking at a high proportion of our community within those prison statistics as well. You know, women are 22 times more likely to be Traveller women are 22 times more likely to be in prison than the general Irish population. And when there's research that are done around that, it is really kind of looking at those statistics of why the crimes that they have committed in order to be in there are small kind of road traffic fines, not paying fines, you know, small fines on tax and insurance and things like that. And I suppose looking at, I suppose, overall and a big issue that is happening at the moment with how women are being treated in society globally, and how I suppose it particularly affects minority women as well. We can see that here, I suppose, in Ireland, when we're looking at kind of what feminism is, we need to begin to look at including women from different minority groups, because a lot of the times Minker and Traveller women are left behind in these feminist talks and movements. And however, when we look at the women in our community, the women in our community are kind of the backbone of our society. I suppose they're at the forefront of everything in our community, but they also stand at protests in general for the wider society mainstream issues that are affecting women as well. So I suppose there's kind of there's a movement there to be followed in including ethnic and indigenous women into these global movements of rights and equality and safety for women in general. So thank you. I'll leave it at that, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you so much, Cindy, for a very strong and also alarming contribution with the very dark numbers of the situation of the Minker community and the women in particular. As you said, the triple discrimination, it's a concept that I heard being said a lot of times in the context of indigenous struggles in Latin America as well. And there are just so many things to follow up on, and I think you advanced some of the issues that I wanted to try to get into, which is perhaps the knowledge contributions and the participation of indigenous women, because I think many times from majority society we have this stereotyping women as passive and receiving violence, but it's not like that necessarily, right? It's complex, like many truths can exist at the same time. So I really wanted to get into the position of the women inside their own community historically, or how has it developed? And I'm referring here to both the Sami community and the Minkir community. Through time, how have the women been able to position themselves to struggle? What have been the hindrances for stronger participation, and what are the knowledge contributions of indigenous women inside their communities, but of course thinking about transformation outside their communities as well, right? Maybe I should start with you, Åsa, because to get you back into the conversation. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, and thank you both to my colleagues in the panel. It was very interesting to listen to you. Well, I think that traditionally and also nowadays, women have a very strong position in the Sami society. Women are usually and have been traditionally taking care of the home and the family, but also many times the economy, the money in the family, and running the economics, and that kind of puts the basis for a very strong position. And I also think that it shows a bit about what we nowadays talk about as a very powerful and position of power, holding the money. But I also think that it might, because I don't think that any community, I'm not now definitely, are gender equal, and not the Sami communities and Sami society either. But I think that what is important to try to look to kind of identify is these also the differences in culture, because as I said, when you hold the money, you are seen as in power, but it's also about how you perceive these different tasks. So I think that when we talk about position of women in indigenous communities, also in the Sami community, we end up always in a discussion on defining what is and what is not, what is good, what is bad, and what is equal and what is not. And when you come from a different culture than the majority culture that is now defining also gender equality, it's easy to kind of get into the same kind of defining, and I think that is something that we need to broaden. We need to broaden the ideas of what it means, and what it means to actually be able to make your own life choices. Because that also means that I should be able to make my own life choices within my culture. And for that to actually happen, we need to strengthen our own possibilities to define our own life choices. So that means basically that we need to strengthen our own institutions so that we can work within our own languages and our own culture, because nowadays we are trapped in these, as you have mentioned also, this triple discrimination, because we are not in position to actually define our life choices. But I would say that if you look through the eyes of many indigenous women, I think that we have so much to contribute with to also the majority societies in broaden the view of what it, as I said, what it actually means to do your own choices. So I think I'll stop there because I really would like to hear what my fellow panelists say on this. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I pass the word to you, Dr. Cindy Joyce.
Thank you, Sue. Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I think that when we're looking at, I suppose, women in our communities, I suppose people looking from the outside in that does not understand the culture and the community and how it works are seeing it from, I suppose, a word here that would be used in Ireland would be from the settled gaze, you know. So they would be looking at it from their understanding, as Asra mentioned, of what is and what isn't, and what should be and what shouldn't be. You know, when we're looking at the women in our community, they know what's right, I suppose, for them in our communities, particularly when we're looking at, I suppose, one of the strong things here with women with Traveller and Minker women in Ireland is their role in primary healthcare. You know, I suppose that is kind of changing the statistics around that when we see kind of the direct involvement of women going out into their communities, speaking about the health issues, speaking about the issues that they need to kind of think about and discuss and have a discussion around that. And I suppose also to bring I suppose, that familiarity as well of somebody from your own community coming out to speak to you about sensitive issues, you know, particularly when you look at kind of the history of the discrimination that that the community face, you know, and when you see kind of other authority people, you know, coming into the communities, kind of dictating what should and what shouldn't be within a community. I think that for that knowledge of Indigenous women needs to be more recognised and respected, and I suppose put more integrated into mainstream policies and strategies around different things like health and education and so forth, and justice. But also, I suppose, when we're looking at it on a global platform, we can see that as I mentioned before, that triple discrimination that we face as Indigenous women, but also, I suppose, within that, the feminist movement, I suppose, needs to, I suppose, have and I suppose that it's beginning to kind of look at what's important within that movement. And I think one of the things that always tends to happen, not just in a feminist movement, but in any movement, that a mainstream movement or platform, it tends to be that we as Indigenous women are excluded from those discussions, and somebody perhaps might speak on our behalf. You know, I think now that it's time that other people don't speak for our communities, you know, that don't know what our culture and identity consists of and how complex it is, and the complex issues there, you know. So I think that it's time now that we as Indigenous women begin to speak for ourselves at these events and movements, but also within policy decision making platforms as well, in order to move things forward for our community. And I think the contribution can be seen in many areas of the importance of I suppose that intersectionality and I suppose that celebrating of difference in society, and the contribution that can make to other groups in society. So I think that that's important to look at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I would like to ask you now, Niev, because we talked about the possibilities and the hindrances of women's participation, and you were talking about this problem of cyber discrimination and cyber hate before, and I know that in many communities, hate speech is one of the big obstacles for women's public participation. So moving back to that topic that you were discussing before, what can be done? Do we need to create safe spaces on the internet, or what could be the measures to battle against hate speech?
Well, I think it's a very complex topic and something that we really don't understand fully. Hate speech is we know quite a lot about it, but at the same time, when we come to the internet, it kind of amplifies things in a way that we haven't necessarily fully understood. And we know, for example, from media theory that we have things about understanding kind of spirals of silence in communication. So how if someone is afraid that what they're going to say will be seen negatively or will be reacted to in a negative way, then they won't participate in a particular topic. And I think this is particularly sensitive and particularly salient, I guess, in the case of minority and indigenous communities. There's already a high threshold for participating in debates and for participating and engaging, that the fear of kind of experiencing a strong and negative reaction will in fact hinder interaction and engagement. So that's one thing. And the other side of it is that there's a certain level of maybe digital social competence that needs to be enhanced and developed. People need to understand the consequences of their own actions and how what can be said can be interpreted and understood in different contexts. And there's a sort of also, I think, this everyday racism, I think, is a concept which I've come across quite a bit as well, in terms of how normalized racism is in the way that we talk and communicate, and that's not often, people are not often aware of it. To any great extent, is an important work to be done in terms of increasing awareness. So I would say more research is needed, specifically with different minority and indigenous communities, to see how do you actually experience this? What is it? What does it mean? What consequences does it have for you? That this kind of interaction can occur in the spaces in which you engage in your everyday life. How does that affect your identity and who you are? And then also, I guess, in terms of trying to educate and ensure that cross-cultural dialogue is there also as well to improve in some ways the quality of communication in these spaces.
Thank you so much. I have many questions on my list. I will not have the time to ask you all the questions. We will open for Q&As before passing the word to the ambassador in a bit. But first, I would just like to ask you, I know that you touched upon it already, some of you, but I stay with the concept of the settler gaze that you were mentioning, Cindy. And I wonder whether the feminist movement or the women's movement in our countries have reproduced this settler gaze. I remember here the critiques of Rauno Kukkonen, a very acknowledged Sami scholar, who has written that Nordic feminists understood the indigenous women's struggles. And now we are on the 8th of March. Streets will be filled up by women and other genders as well, struggling for equal societies and freedom. What is needed for solidarity alliances to be strengthened? What do we need, and are they necessary, these solidarity alliances? Are they desired by the indigenous women, or how can the broader or the majority, let's say, women's movements gain a better, perhaps, understanding or concepts of solidarity with the indigenous women? So I pass the word to you, Åsa.
Thank you. And to the first answer to your question is yes. I think that the national majority feminist movement has a settler gaze also, because that is something that it's a settler gaze on all aspects of indigenous societies, also on the Sami society, due to the lack of knowledge of Sami culture and Sami traditional livelihoods. And it's very hard to take something into consideration if you don't know about it, and you don't, then you can't understand it. So I would say that, and we often bring this up as a huge challenge, and that's the lack of knowledge. But I also believe that to some point, when we look at the Nordic countries, there is kind of a limit to when the Nordic countries and majority society cannot any longer kind of blame the lack of knowledge for not taking responsibility and not making something and to act on what we do know. So I would say that yes, also the feminist movement has a settler gaze, but there is need for to join forces, because I also, as women, I think that there's a possibility to understand women in also other groups, and there is a will to understand. So I think that there is a need for collaboration and to join forces between indigenous women and other and women in other groups, and also a lot of much more collaboration and knowledge sharing between other parts of society. But I do believe that it's a bigger issue than I think that what we need is kind of to bring forward the indigenous societies into kind of an open up for and more to be more visible in the majority societies, because well, knowledge builds societies, and also our knowledge need to have space to build our society, and I think that if that recognition of that for the Nordic countries and for the Sami communities, that we are two people in Sweden as well as in Norway and Finland, and there are many peoples on the Russian side. I think that is the first step to actually recognizing that also the majority society will gain from knowing and also Sami culture and indigenous cultures. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Now, Cindy, do you have any comments on those questions? Perhaps brief comments in order to open up for quick Q&As?
Not particularly, just brief. Just saying that I absolutely agree. I think that we need to be more visible in those spaces. However, I think as well that those spaces need to be much more welcoming than what they are at the moment to indigenous women and women from other groups. I think that it's important for those spaces to take on that responsibility to open up those spaces and make the places a welcoming space for and safe space for indigenous women. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Before we open for Q&As, just a short to take you back in also, Niam, to the conversation. You have several times called for more research and more investigation. But now, if I understood also correctly, she said that it's not always, we cannot always signalize a lack of knowledge, like the, let's say, the inability of acting of the institutions of majority society, perhaps are discussed as a lack of knowledge, but maybe we talk about lack of political will. Do you think knowledge can really, do we need more investigation, or do we already have the information we need, and what we are actually facing is unwillingness to take strong political measures?
So I guess here we're really going into the politics of knowledge, which is very complicated when we get into like indigenous and minority communities, because we've got this kind of importance of, we'll say, like indigenous decolonizing methodologies and ways of knowledge, and the importance of communities generating knowledge and that knowledge being an exchange, like both between communities, majority and minority, and across context as well. I definitely accept that more can be done politically, but I would at the same time say that there is a need for more research and more knowledge, and the problem often being, for example, with statistical knowledge, we'll say in the case of the Sami community, where Åsa mentioned that it's not possible to say how many Sami people live in the different countries, because statistics are not gathered on the basis of ethnicity. That then has consequences for the kind of investigations that you can make further. So to take again the topic of cyber hate and how indigenous children might experience this, you cannot do a statistical quantitative analysis of this topic, because we don't have a population, we don't have an understanding of what the universe that we're dealing with is. And that has consequences because of the extent to which knowledge generation at the broader level emphasizes and is based on using statistical research. So if you're seeking research funding and you cannot engage in statistical research, then the knowledge that you're producing is understood and valued in a different way. So this kind of, there's a very vicious circle of how knowledge is produced and what kind of knowledge is valued and what kind of paradigms we are understanding and can generate knowledge within, that really needs to be maybe teased out and opened up a bit more. So I would say both political will also in the case of generating opportunities for more research and understanding the consequences, and I guess understanding what knowledge is being produced and the importance of that knowledge and the consequences that it has then for policy as well.
Thank you so much. I see in the chat that we have received some questions. I will ask one of them because I think the other may have been responded already, and then pass the words to the ambassador. So the question is for Joyce. It says, I am Irish and very happy to hear you speak today. I am interested in your views on the impact of Irish Catholicism on women travelers.
Just briefly, because I know that we're running out of time, so it's a bit difficult to fully answer that question, because it's quite complex, not only with women from my community, but I suppose for Irish women in general, particularly with the relationship in the last 40 to 50 years with the Catholic Church and Irish society itself. So I suppose my answer to that is that I don't have an answer at the moment, because I just haven't got enough time to go into it. But I suppose that is something that we have to look at it as well, I suppose, and see, I suppose, like I suppose in wider Irish society, and also the impact on our community as well, of that relationship between the Catholic Church and Ireland itself in general. Thanks.
Okay, I just scanned the other questions here, but actually I think that the panelists already touched upon a lot of the topics that were raised in the chat. So on my behalf, I just want to thank you so much for the possibility of listening to you. It was certainly very interesting, and I have a lot to think about now. So to end up, I will pass the word to Ireland's ambassador in Finland, Parkin Ruth.
Hello, thank you very much, Susanne. My name is Ruth Parkin, and I'm the Irish ambassador in Finland, indeed. And I want to, first of all, thank the panelists and you, Susanne, for your moderation, for a really interesting and thought-provoking discussion. It's International Women's Day. It's important that we take this opportunity to expose the issues that are facing women across the world in all their different facets. And I think you did a really good job of touching on so many of the different aspects that are facing, minority people who are coming from minority languages, particularly women and girls, people who are coming from indigenous and ethnic minorities. The question of those issues which are facing Minkar, Traveller, Saami women in societies which I hope we can consider to be at the top of our game in terms of economic and political development. And I think it's very important that we recognise that even when we live in countries where we have a huge amount of what we place importance on, rule of law, respect, democracy, that we can trust our legal systems, that there are still a huge amount of issues being faced by people who live within those societies. And it's a challenge for all of us to work on how we can do our part to expose those issues and to assist in making sure that they are addressed and to constantly question. I think not to get too high level political, but I think it is important that for Finland, they are on the Human Rights Council now, and Ireland is on the Security Council. At the very beginning, Åsa mentioned the work of the UN. And it's important that we as countries allow ourselves to be questioned at the highest level, as well as to challenge others. And I think that there are many more issues that you exposed today and others that we could discuss for another hour to come. And I hope that we will have the opportunity to continue discussing those issues. For us in the region, as colleagues in the Nordic area, we are working to implement the Nordic strategy from Ireland, to find and develop connections between Ireland and the Nordic countries. For us, that means also finding ways that we can work together to improve and enhance our work with communities that maybe we haven't worked with as much in the past, and that we should work more together with to make sure that we are representing the experiences of all the people who live in our countries. And that's very important for me as a diplomat, that I understand who I represent, the country and the people that live there. And so I want to thank you also for enhancing my knowledge of both where I live, but also and the people that I represent. I hope that at some time in the future, we can begin to talk more about visibility, the role of truth, the role of knowledge exposure, bringing things into mainstream society, and how we can challenge those of us who come from that society to really question ourselves as to when we're making policies and how policymakers should address these issues. But now, in true Nordic form, we are almost dead on time. And this is a wonderful thing about living in this region, is that you know that when something starts, it's going to start, and when something finishes, it's going to finish. So I hope that we have another opportunity to do this, that we have the opportunity to meet in person. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. And if you're watching back, I hope you found it useful, and I hope we'll be able to continue the discussion in the future. Thank you.